It's time to take stock, I think, ladies and gentlemen, and we're going to do so in the company of Neil Oliver, who is the presenter, of course, of The Coast Show, but he is also, by trade, an historian. He's an archaeologist. He's a man that knows an awful lot about the history of this country, the history of the world, and what we are currently seeing is a group of politically motivated anarchists attempting to change the history of this country, attempting to airbrush out the people they don't like from the history of this country and somehow present us with a very different formation of what we should be doing going forward, right? The relentless attempts by the mainstream media in this country to dislodge this government and to ask questions that are going to be awkward ones to answer have led us to this point, okay? Yesterday, Sadiq Khan gloated about the removal of a statue of Robert Milligan, a trader and slave owner from the 18th century who founded the docks at West India Quay in London's East End. Apparently, Tower Hamlets Council, which is also ram-packed full of lefties, basically said that they found the statue offensive, despite the fact they didn't find it offensive in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s or indeed the noughties. So we're talking 50 odd years they allowed that statue to stand. Suddenly yesterday they decided it had to go. Absolutely and utterly ridiculous. 0344 499 1000. We've also heard of some students up in Liverpool who want Gladstone's name removed from a hall of residence. Gladstone was one of the great liberals of this country, for heaven's sake. Where is this going to end? What are we going to end up doing to ourselves? I think it's a very dangerous time, and I think we need more common sense than ever. Please join me right here on Talk Radio. Call us 0344 499 1000. You're listening to me, Mike Graham, on the fastest growing radio station on the planet. It is, of course, Talk Radio.
Mid-morning with Mike Graham. Talk Radio.
Now, we had Neil Oliver on a show just a little while ago, probably a week and a half ago or so, to come on. He was on our homeschooling section where he talks about the great wealth of wonder around Britain and how the coastline of Britain is such a wonderful place. We've been talking a little bit since then, and he's got a lot to say about education, about history, and about the world that we are now changing into. Neil, a very good morning to you. Welcome back.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, listen, thank you so much for being here, because we are, I think, never before have we been in such need of some voices of common sense, and I believe you to be one of those, because what we're seeing at the moment, Neil, is quite extraordinary, isn't it?
I certainly think it is. I certainly don't think that selectively editing the past is any way to leading to any kind of productive and happy future. I certainly take a position where we need more history, more clues to history, more pages from the story, if possible. I say that you add to history, you don't subtract from it. When you run across characters whose morals you don't approve of, and you take them out of the context in which they lived, that's the early steps. I find it very concerning that this kind of behaviour is a step on the road that leads to to mob rule, to the tumbrils, to the guillotine. Who are these self-appointed people who believe that they're able to make these value judgments?
Well, exactly right.
They stand in judgment, and I think that's a very dangerous precedent. Who among us, has the kind of moral purity, moral certainty to be able to make those judgments? That's why we have a process. That's why if people think that there should be changes to their built landscape, there's a process for making that happen, which is legal. And if you cannot have a system that guarantees process for the worst of us, then it certainly won't protect the best of us.
Exactly.
We need to understand more, not selectively edit. So I find it very troubling, very worrisome. I watched the film. I watched the film of the statue. The questionable statue being taken down
Edward
in
Colston, yeah.
And I thought it was incredibly ironic, because it was almost certainly I was able to watch it because it was being filmed on mobile phones. And we know pretty certainly that, so many of those smartphones are assembled by modern-day slaves.
Yeah.
And people were wearing clothes from sweatshops, which they know are being put together by modern-day slaves.
Yes.
And there's a terrible irony in filming and celebrating the end of the statue of a slaver from the 17th century in that way. And I watched the footage. And I was so troubled and astonished by it. We're modern 21st century people, and the statue came down and people were slapping it with their bare hands. And as it was being rolled through the streets, someone had tied a rope around the legs, as though it really was the person.
Yes.
And then it was ceremonially dumped into the into the harbour as though to drown him. Edward Colston lived and died 300 years ago. He died aged 84, tucked up warm in his bed, as far as I understand it.
After having committed many philanthropic acts, and including setting up hospitals, setting up schools for the poor.
Whether there's a process, if people do decide that they want to get rid of statues, if they want to get rid of anything, then there's a democratic process which is there to protect all of us at all times. And we cannot go to the point where self-appointed mobs are making decisions and acting upon them. It's all very harmless and good fun now when it's a bronze statue.
Yeah.
These are baby steps on a road that leads to catastrophic places.
Well, Kristallnacht was not far from my thoughts when I was watching that, because one thing I hate is a mob in any event. The second thing I hate is the police standing by and letting it happen. And, as I've said to many people since that moment, since that statue was torn down, what if they come to you next? They come to your house and they decide that you're some kind of horrible racist, and they drag you out of your house and they throw you in the harbour? Because that's, I think, what we're all talking about here.
Yes, enough is enough. I think what has happened so far is too much. That process by which people are encouraged to think that they can be denouncing, in this instance, people from the past, but that's baby steps on a road that leads to people being encouraged to think that they can denounce family members, their neighbours, and that's what happened in Mao Zedong's China in the Cultural Revolution. 30 odd million people were hounded in that way. Ultimately 100 million people died in Mao's China.
Yeah.
And yet people feel happy and proud to wear T-shirts with Mao's face on them even today.
Yeah.
Che Guevara, the iconic poster boy of communism.
Yeah.
Read the Motorcycle Diaries and see what he had to say about people of colour. If you want to question people's position on race, look at Che. And yet people feel delighted to wear a T-shirt or have a poster on their bedroom wall of Che.
Yeah. It's extraordinary.
And the architect of that whole system, the whole system of communism, socialism, that as far as we know, killed in excess of 100 million people in the 20th century alone. The architects of that were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Read their correspondence, read their books, see what they had to say about people of colour and other races.
Yeah.
And in any event, the Gulag system in Russia that led to the deaths of, well, who knows, 50 million people, we don't really know, we probably never will. That was slavery. That was because it was understood pretty early on that the communist system would only work if it had forced labour, which is another word for slaves. And yet people still, there's no talk I'm seeing of people taking down statues of Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels. And I'm not saying there should be. I'm not advocating the removal of anyone's statue, because once you start, he who controls the past controls the future.
Well, I listen to
understand the most that we possibly can. Why are the cannons? Why are the guns being turned on individuals and the history of this country? I would like people to point at another country in the world where as many people have as much of a chance of a good life as they have here. This is an
people,
we know this, but
and people continue to flock here, Neil, from all sorts of corners of the world, because they believe Britain to be a fair country, a place where they do have a chance to succeed, regardless of their background, regardless of their religion, regardless of the colour of their skin. And you're absolutely right. But how much of this do you think is kind of pandered to by the left? And I have to say the left in this country, because that's what it is. We've got Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner taking the knee. We've got Labour MPs literally encouraging people to tear down statues. Sadiq Khan setting up a commission to nominate 60 statues that should be removed. We've got people like Lewis Hamilton talking about removing all evidence of any kind of racial discrimination in terms of monuments to anything in the world now, not just in Britain. And I mean, how much also is this down to the education process of some of these people who are now in their 20s who believe Britain to have once been an evil place?
Well, we need more history. We need more understanding of history. You don't do away with history because you're embarrassed by it or ashamed of it. People have the right to criticise in this country. We're able to stand up and say what we think, or we are at the moment, and that is something that is to be cherished above all other prizes.
Yeah.
And it's a gem. It's not a gem. A gem is hard. It's fragile like a flower. You seize the flower, the bloom is dead. You can't risk moving into a situation where people aren't allowed to criticise. This criticism that is going on at the moment is the product of a free country, and we arrived at this destination at the end of a long and bloody road.
Yeah.
We've been through terrible times nationally. We've been dreadful to each other, to our neighbours. We've also been spectacularly good at other times to each other, to our neighbours. But it's been a long and checkered story, and you don't get to edit it. I do wonder at the history education that's being made available. I mean, at the moment, as far as it stands, if someone was saying to me about going to university to study history, I would say you'd be better off getting a job and spending the money buying books.
Yes.
And educate. You can get as good an education in the subject of history from a good bookshop, but you should get to the bookshops fast, because this process by where certain things are being edited out, a next step, another baby step along that dangerous road is the burning of books.
Yes.
And you mentioned that certain comedy shows and films are being taken down.
Imagine removing Gone with the Wind, one of the greatest movies ever made and a great study of what happened in the Civil War in America, and now they're saying we shouldn't watch it.
Well, anything you don't. It's so dangerous to be advocating a situation where certain things are taken away. You're better off keeping your dirty linen out where people can see it.
Yeah.
You might say that these statues of people who were slavers and involved in the slave trade, they're there to be seen. They're being named and shamed. They're there for everyone to see. And what would be much more effective, I would have thought, is rather than subtracting and taking them away, you add to it. You add to the context.
Yeah.
Maybe you put up other statuary there or in other places that tell the rest of the story.
Yes.
You tell the rest of the story. You don't edit out characters because what they did was shameful.
Right.
You remember the shame.
And also, as I was saying to an earlier guest, the Robert Milligan statue, which I've never actually seen in East India Quay, he was a very significant figure. That was the word that we used in that segment of the show. And yes, he may have been a ghastly individual who traded slaves and owned slaves, I think, at the time that he died. But he was a significant figure. And part of the whole statuary thing is that back in those days when we put statues up to people, they made statues of people they regarded as significant. And therefore, that's an interesting thing in itself, isn't it?
It's important to know. It's relevant and valid to see the way people thought in the past.
Yeah.
And to see how far we have come. But you don't knock down the milestones along that long road in the belief that you're furthering anybody's education.
Right.
You have to. These people have to be visible. These embarrassing, shameful, horrifying parts of the story have to be there so that people can see them. And you augment, you add, you don't subtract. You don't subtract from history, you add to it.
It seems extraordinary that we've got in Leeds yesterday people writing murderer and painting and daubing paint over a statue of Queen Victoria. We've got Liverpool students asking for a Gladstone residence hall to be renamed. I mean, Gladstone is not exactly one of those people that you would put up, even if you were to do it, as some kind of evil, personified of his time.
Well, with my hand on my heart, I would say that the debate about whether statues should or shouldn't be left standing, that is, in a democratic country, that is of course a conversation that's there to be had. And if there is, I would say in the context of statuary in the nation's capital, which is London, it might be something not just for the people of London to debate and to decide. It might be something that requires a national conversation from far away Orkney to the Channel Islands.
Yeah, because it's our nation's capital, isn't it?
You might have to debate that, and I wouldn't stand in the way of a majority decision that said we must have a conversation about this.
Yes. But you see, this is one of the things that was said about Edward Colston, because the people who pulled the statue down said, but we've been having conversations about this for a long time and nothing's happened. Well, the reason for that is because people could not agree on its removal. The majority of people in Bristol did not want its removal. So the fact that a small minority of people did, and have now suddenly taken to taking the law into their own hands, that's not a justification.
No, and it's so dangerous. The idea, people people are looking on. You know, this specific example of Edward Colston and his story, and people are saying, well, because of who he was and what he did, we think it's right. And MPs and journalists are standing by, if not cheering on.
Including the police as well, by the way.
What happened there? But that's not the way that these decisions ought to be taken. It's one thing if you think that it's happening to the right person today. Well, tomorrow it might be happening to your neighbour or your friend, and the day after that it might be happening to you. And if you have previously stood by and said, well, under certain circumstances the mob are entitled to take their own decisions and act on it, then your cries for mercy are more likely to fall on deaf ears if you have previously been part of the chorus of people saying that at certain times the mob can take the law into its own hands.
Yes, well, I mean, you're basically saying they can...
Everything has to be a result of due process. We've arrived, after hundreds of bloody and difficult years, at a system that's almost unique in the world. The fact that we have a civilization that we are able to criticise and insist on change, that's not natural.
No.
The natural is a damned mess.
Well,
it's around at the world why aren't they turning their guns on where modern day slavery is there?
Right.
Living among us.
Which is far easier to do because they could simply boycott things, which is what they also quite like to do at times when it suits them. They could easily boycott the manufacturers of those clothes, boycott the manufacturers of those phones. But it takes you back to that Martin Niemöller quote, doesn't it? Where he ends up saying, then they came for me, and there was nobody left. Well,
exactly. I mean, it's a danger. It's a game called feeding the crocodile.
Yeah.
You keep feeding the crocodile in the belief that as long as you keep doing that, you'll be eaten last. But eventually you run out of food.
Yeah, right.
And the crocodile is never sated, and eventually the crocodile comes for you. So you can't allow it. We don't have lynching. You don't have public lynching. Even in a situation where maybe a large body of people would say, well, that person deserved it. But that's not how we do things. We have due process, and we have agreed upon the process democratically. That has been our tradition, and one of the traditions that has been upheld so successfully in our part of the world, if only relatively recently in historical terms, is the absolute right of the individual. Every individual must be protected. Every individual must be protected and must go through due process, habeas corpus, and all the rest of it. We've written for hundreds of years into law the fact that individual rights must be protected, and we have a process for making decisions, taking decisions, and going ahead with revolutionary action if we want to. But
yes.
we decide that as a population, as a people.
But what we seem to have lost, Neil, as well, is the ability to delineate between sort of anarchism, which is what tends for me to be leading these movements, right? The movements that are marching through the streets, the people who want to destroy capitalism, that want to tear down statues, and sort of general, what you might regard as mainstream politics, because the mainstream politics are seemingly siding with the anarchists without realising where that takes them.
Yes, there's a turning of a blind eye and a deaf ear at the moment, presumably because people think, well, this one doesn't matter.
Well, because they think they look good. It's this virtue signalling thing. I'm looking at a great tweet here from Tom Holland. 2006, a proposal was put forward to rename all streets and buildings in Liverpool linked to the slave trade. The plans were dropped only when it became clear that scrapping Penny Lane might damage the tourism industry. How ironic is that?
One of the great authors of the 20th, maybe the greatest author of the 20th century, is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who went through the Gulag system in Russia. He was a Russian soldier. He was convicted of whatever and sent into the Gulag system, and he was there for years. And when he came out, he wrote the Gulag Archipelago, which arguably is the single text that brought down the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
It was literally a world-changing document, and he was a Nobel Prize-winning author. And it's an 1,800-page long roar, scream of pain.
It's an extraordinary piece of work. Yeah.
And the distillation from it is that the line separating good and evil doesn't pass through any state, any political party, or any class. It runs through every human heart. Now that is a vitally, crushingly important point that everyone has to remember. If you think you as an individual have the right to stand in judgment, then you're a very dangerous person.
Yes.
Because in the heart of every single one of us is the concentration camp guard, is the torturer, is the murderer. That monster is there inside each and every one of us. And if you're not aware of that truth, if you can't accept that truth about the human condition, then you are a very, very dangerous creature indeed. But it's because enough individuals in our part of the world have accepted that reality that we don't allow the mob to do what it sometimes wants to do. Because we know that the monsters are not other people, the monsters are us, each and every one of us. You know, that line between good and evil passes through our hearts. And that's why we have evolved a system after centuries of agony where there is a process and we don't hide things, and things aren't, dirty linen isn't kept out of sight where possible. Things are brought out and discussed, and we consider what people have done, and collectively we make decisions about what should happen next. But
well, somebody needs to get a grip of this, and I don't know who that person would be. I'd like to think it should be the Prime Minister. Somebody needs to get a grip of it. Enough
is enough. This has gone far enough.
Yeah, it's dreadful. Listen, Neil, fantastic to talk to you. Thank you so much. Very thoughtful, very thought-provoking as well. I think Neil Oliver speaks for the commonsensical people of this country. Not only that, he's an expert in history. He's a man that knows his history. He knows that history cannot be rewritten, cannot be reinvented, cannot be airbrushed, and should never be. It's as simple as that.